And let us continue with the 7th chapter of The Indian in the Cupboard, A Bitter Disappointment. Upon receiving the key from Jessica Charlotte, Omri and his father realized it was too small to even see. There was a paragraph break, and we'll pick up from there. For the next 2 weeks, Omri had a lesson. He didn't realize it straight away, but what gradually dawned on him, watching his father, was that he had been wrong and smug to think for one single moment that he, Omri, was the grown-up one here. Being grown up was attitude, not experience. His dad proved that he was the grown-up. Omri, for his part, fell into a steep depression. He couldn't be bothered with anything. He did no work at school except what he was forced to. He was rude to his mother. He had a fight with Guion. He excused himself to himself by thinking that he was desperately worried about Little Bear. But what he was really doing was giving way to a terrible mood because he couldn't go, because their adventure was cancelled. But his dad was quite different. You'd never have thought he'd had a bitter disappointment. He carried on just as usual and was his usual self. He didn't appear to be particularly moody or sad. He didn't say a word more on the subject to Omri. The only way Omri knew he was still thinking about it was that he began to sketch Indians. A pile of books appeared in the end room, the one at Omri and Gillion's end of the house. The one at Omri and Guion's end of the house. The TV-free zone. Omri saw this one day when he was passing through from the stairs to the dining room. He paused to look. They were from the London Library, which sent out books to members. They were all about Indians. Some of them were illustrated. It was from these pictures that his dad was sketching. But he wasn't working much in his studio, which was highly unusual. He spent most of his free time in the end room reading. Omri sensed he didn't want to be disturbed or questioned, but he couldn't help himself. After a few more days, he just had to ask. He felt so bad, and it seemed his dad didn't. "Dad?" Said his dad, from the depths of a book called The Ambiguous Iroquois. "What's the point?" His dad understood at once and looked at him. "The point, bub," he said, "is to learn all I can." "But now we can't go." "I know, it's tough, but I just feel I owe it to him somehow." Omri edged closer. "What have you found out?" His father closed the book on his finger and leant his head back against the chair. "It's a damn shame Little Bear didn't belong to one of the tribes farther west. Of course, in the long term, they were no better off, but the crunch hadn't come for them in Little Bear's time. There were still plenty of Indians living their lives in the old way, all across the American West. And that went on for decades, till the West was won, as the old movies say. But in the East, things were different and worse, because that's where the first settlers from Europe landed. It was where the French and English wars happened, which the Eastern tribes were involved in. By Little Bear's era, the settlers were really spreading out, and the tribes were being driven away. Some were in danger of being wiped out. "Not the Iroquois!" exclaimed Omri in a shocked voice. "How much have you read about the Six Nations?" "A lot." "So you know they had a seriously dramatic type of government?" "Oh yes, some people say the government of the United States was based on it." "Well, I'm not so sure about that, but they made a confederacy with other tribes that were related to them in order to have peace and to cooperate with each other. They had laws and customs that in some ways were better than what white people had. The white settlers called them savages, but by the end of the 18th century the boot was on the other foot." "They used to be terribly cruel," Omri said doubtfully. "The Indians I read." "Yes, many of the tribes were cruel, but they were very fierce and warlike. The Iroquois had a fearsome reputation, but, according to the accounts of a few unprejudiced white men who travelled among them, they could show us a few things about civilized behavior. Listen to this. I must just read you this. It really struck me." He put his book down and picked up another called North American Indians that had a number of slips of paper in it, marking particular places. "The man who wrote this, George Catlin, was an artist. How I'd love to think that if I'd lived there I'd have done what he did. In the 1830s he travelled and lived among the tribes of the West, the ones who were still living as they always had, who hadn't been shoved around and missionized and corrupted by the whites. But of course Catlin knew they were going to be. He'd seen what happened to the ones in the East. This whole book he wrote is full of sadness because he knew that the people he was painting the portraits of and making friends with were on the edge of extinction. He used words about them like noble, honourable, gentlemanly, and religious. Their own religion, not the priest's. He liked and admired them in many ways. He liked and admired them in many ways, but he didn't like everything about them. Once he had this conversation with the chief of the Sioux. He was saying how bad it was, the way they tortured their prisoners, and when he'd finished some pretty outspoken criticism, the chief mentioned that he'd heard that white people choked wrongdoers to death like dogs on the end of a rope, not enemies of their own people, and Catlin said yes. They did shut each other up did they shut each other up in prisons for most of their lives, sometimes because they couldn't pay money, so Catlin said yes to that too. Then the chief said he'd visited white men's forts, and seen soldiers taken out and whipped almost to death, and heard they let themselves be treated like that by their own comrades just to earn a soldier's pay. And could it be true that white people hit their own children? Catlin said they often did, and the chief just kept quietly asking about other white people's customs, such as robbing graves and abusing their own women, and Catlin kept making notes and keeping his head down and feeling more and more uncomfortable, and at last the chief asked if it was true that the Great Spirit of the white people was the child of a white woman, and that white people had killed him, referring to Jesus, of course. When Catlin said yes to that, the chief simply couldn't believe it and said, The Indian's Great Spirit got no mother. The Indians no kill him. He never die. At that point, Catlin writes, he was quite glad to close my notebook and quietly escape from the throng that had collected around me, and saying, though to myself and silently, that these and a hundred other vices belong to the civilized world. Who then are the cruel and relentless savages? Omri took the book out of his father's hands and leafed through it, looking at the pictures, which had all been painted by the author. They were beautiful and striking. Omri was struck by how different the Indians looked from one another, how differently they dressed. Some of them looked almost Chinese, others looked quite European. This surprised him. He'd always somehow thought about Indians as being more or less like Little Bear. Are there any portraits of the Iroquois? Page 377, said his father, consulting a notepad. Omri turned to that page and saw a picture of a man called Nottoway, chief of the Iroquois. He was magnificent, with a burst of mixed feathers on his head, a beautiful tunic, buckskin leggings and moccasins, a blanket over his left shoulder, ornamental armbands and belt, and a tomahawk in his right hand. Omri stared at him, playing with the wonderful notion that he might, just might, be Tall Bear's son, Little Bear's grandson. He glanced at the opposite page and read that George Catlin had admired Nottoway, an excellent man, and learnt from him that the Iroquois had conquered nearly all the world, but the Great Spirit, being offended at the great slaughters of his favorite people, resolved to punish them, and sent a dreadful disease among them that carried most of them off, and the rest were killed by their enemies. Omri's heart sickened. Weren't there any Iroquois left at all? That was what Catlin thought, said his dad. He was very doomful about the outlook for all the Indian tribes. That was partly why he wanted to paint them before it was too late. But they weren't all wiped out, not a bit of it, so don't despair. And, he added under his breath, I don't want Little Bear to despair either, however bad things look. His favourite people, said Omri slowly. The Iroquois thought they were the Great Spirit's favourite people. Yeah, said his father quietly. The chosen. Where have we heard that before? Omri put the book down. Have you found out it's true what Little Bear said? Well, the English being rotten? His dad was silent for a moment. You know, we British were top dogs in the world for quite a long time, but top dogs often think that power is enough, and that hanging on to power is more important than behaving well. We haven't as much to be ashamed of as a lot of colonial powers, but that doesn't mean we haven't anything to blush for. Have you ever heard the expression perfidious Albion? No, what does it mean? Well, Albion was the old word for England, and perfidious, of course, means treacherous. In 2 words, it means promise breakers. Double dealers. Englishmen always prided themselves on being men of their word, but our rulers haven't always lived up to that. I'm sorry to say our treatment of the Indian tribes that helped Britain in its colonial wars was not a shining example of honour. So we kind of owe them. Yes. We left our Indian allies in the lurch all right, round about 1783. but there were still decisions for the Indians to take. Bad ones that led to extinction, and not so bad ones that led to survival, at least for some. You don't know how badly I wanted to find a way to help Little Bear to make the right one. And that is the end of Chapter 7.